Today, I'd like to introduce you to an idea I've come across that makes the process of learning new pieces much more reliable. I've called this interleaving. However, as I've said in many of my other videos, quite often the most valuable thing about an idea is how we then link it to other ideas and combine them. And that's what I'd like to explain in this video. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. In a nutshell, interleaving is the idea of interspersing the work we do on one thing with something completely different. And in fact, it was probably on reading about spaced repetition that this idea came to me. Now, we all know, or at least we've all been told, repetition is the mother of all learning. However, there have been lots of studies done that show that if you space out these repetitions rather than just doing them all in one go together, you actually do learn faster. And the reason for this is that it sort of pushes the brain to try and recall things that it was doing before, but not immediately before. However, at the other end of the spectrum is something that I read in Heinrich Neuhaus' book, The Art of Piano Playing, where he says we should work on something relentlessly until we've mastered it before moving on to something else. And the analogy he uses is that of letting the water boil, saying that keep moving on to do different things is a little like taking a kettle off the heat when we're trying to boil water and then wondering why the water isn't boiling. So how could we then combine these two ideas that do seem polar opposite? And what I found was the helpful idea was, in fact, thinking of limiting the amount of water we might want to boil at any one point in time. So rather than boil an entire kettle, just boil a teaspoon. Of course, within a piece of music, this might be limiting the amount of material that we're going to use. So maybe just a couple of measures at a time, or limiting a specific task, such as working the fingering. This way, we're able to spend just a few minutes doing something and be able to make the water boil at the same time. This means effectively that we're able to move from one thing to another while still doing adequate work on each thing, but introducing then some space between the repetitions that we're doing of that. Let's consider the very initial stages of learning a piece. I tend to work on individual pieces anything between 20 and 30 minutes in one sitting. Thus, with the best will in the world, there's perhaps limited progress that can be expected in this amount of time. I've been recently learning Rachmaninoff's Prelude in D. This is Henley level 6, which for me is on the outer difficulty limits. When learning this, I split it into 4 sections. I then split each section into segments and each segment into snippets. Now, the video I've linked in the comments explains this process. So let's think about how I can interleave this. So for the first few days of working on this, I would only concentrate uniquely on 2 small segments from different parts of the piece. For example, these few measures of the first section and these few measures of the third section. Now, you might wonder why I choose from different sections, and in fact it's simply because the design of the music is quite different here, and so it feels sufficiently distinct from the first section so as to make my brain think that it is in fact something totally different. Spending just 5 minutes on such a tiny part is a sufficient amount of time for me, at least, to make some actual progress. If only maybe to work out the fingering on day 1. Once my 5 minutes are up, I will then push myself to my next tiny part. For these next few measures, because this is a little harder than the section 1, I would probably simplify it for my initial practice and so omit parts of the left and right hands, for example. Again, working on just this small part and in this somewhat simplified version, it means that in 5 minutes I can make some meaningful progress if my goal is small enough. Then, once my 5 minutes are up, I go back to the first section and practice exactly the same part I was working at earlier in exactly the same way. Then, as you might have guessed, I go back to section 3 and work on exactly the same part in exactly the same way 5 minutes later. Thus, I'm interleaving here by putting 5 minutes of something different between my repetitions of any one part on any one day. And this takes me conveniently to 20 minutes. If we then limit our next day's practice to simply work on these same areas in exactly the same ways, then of course we've introduced an even bigger space between our repetitions. Yet, we are also letting the water boil by ensuring we thoroughly work on our chosen segments. However, we can then take our interleaving a stage further. For example, after 2 or 3 days of working on our initial 2 segments, we might then choose 2 different ones, likely the next snippets. If I'm using a simplification strategy, I'd probably stick with the same simplified version still. And then again, we might do this for a few days until both of these little bits start to feel good. But then, rather than moving forward, we actually go backwards and re-look at the bits that we first started with. Notice the theme. Now we've introduced an even bigger space between these repetitions as we spent time a few days working on the next part. If these are still feeling good, then the next day we can go to our second set, and then if we're still happy with them afterwards, we can learn the next few measures of each section. We might continue in a similar manner until we've got to the end of each section. What really pays off here is that by limiting the amount of material and carefully spacing out our repetitions, we actually progress faster. It isn't long before we can make meaningful progress on 2 segments at a time, and then the entire section, as we went so deeply into each tiny bit. Once we've reached the end of each section, we might, for example, put sections 1 and 3 to one side and start afresh on sections 2 and 4. We again choose tiny bits to work on at a time, and we can also use simplification strategies too. Again, we need something that is small enough and easy enough that we can feel we make progress on it within 5 or so minutes. As we get to the end of sections 2 and 4, we can then go back to sections 1 and 3. What you might find is that initially it feels like we've forgotten what we learned. However, I've noticed that in fact it comes back exceptionally quickly as we learned it in such depth in the first place. One tip I found exceptionally powerful is that in the initial learning stages, I don't try to get from 0 to the final as written version in one group of practice sessions. By letting something marinate for a few days, so not practicing it at all, before starting to add back any notes I might have removed, it actually speeds up the learning process. So let's say with section 3, I started with just part of the left hand, plus the main right hand notes. When returning to this section, I would first start from this point and then perhaps add back the remaining left hand notes, yet still omitting these offbeat notes in the right hand. I've spoken about this idea of simplifying in many of my tutorials, and it's one of my favourite ways of learning things. Now, what we've just gone through here, of course, is the idea of using interleaving at a very micro level, so within a particular practice session, within a particular piece. However, we can also use it at a more macro level. Now, one thing that I've noticed in terms of the number of hours it might take me to learn something is that it can be well worthwhile putting a piece entirely to one side halfway through the process and forcing myself not to go back and tinker with it. So, for example, in the prelude we talked about today, I basically got myself first to the point that I pretty much knew all the notes for the entire piece end to end, but I didn't move on to try and polish it up. I put it away, put it to one side, left it for a couple of months, and then came back to it. And okay, again, you find initially that you think you've forgotten everything that you learned, but it comes back surprisingly quickly. And I think it does that because we are able to retrieve it from storage based on the fact we did much deep work with it. And of course, this means that we've introduced yet another big space between the repetitions that we're doing of one individual piece. So give this a try on a piece that you're working on at the moment and let me know how you get on. And I'll link a tutorial to the prelude in the description of this video once I've had the time to record it. So make sure to subscribe and to hit the notification bell so you know about that video when it's released. And thank you very much for watching today, and I do look forward to seeing you very soon.